Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
I knew something was off the second I walked into the conference room and saw 3 chairs instead of 2. That third chair, the one they didn't bother to tell me about, belonged to Trent Whitaker, our newly minted chief operating officer, the kind of guy who wore a $250,000 watch and made sure you noticed it every time he shook your hand. Beside him sat Marla from HR, pretending to take notes on her iPad while her eyes darted everywhere except my face. My own boss, Gary Hines, couldn't even make it. Family emergency, they said. That part was almost funny. The emergency was me. Trent smiled the way a dentist does before telling you the tooth has to go. Hey, Rob, thanks for coming in on short notice. I'd worked at that company for 12 years, and suddenly I was being summoned like some part-time intern. I gave him a polite nod, didn't sit down. Didn't need to. I could already smell the blood in the water, and I knew whose it was. Trent folded his hands on the table, real serious now, and said the words like he was reading them off a napkin at a networking event. We've been evaluating performance across departments, and after careful consideration, we've decided to go in a different direction with your role. That was it. No numbers, no feedback, no attempt to explain how the guy who personally handled 36 out of our 52 corporate accounts was suddenly underperforming. I stood there and waited. He gave me a second, maybe hoping I'd make it easier by breaking down, by begging. But I didn't. I've seen enough of this game to know when the dice are loaded. I just raised my eyebrows and said, "You sure about that?" He blinked like I'd slapped him. Not hard, just enough to rattle his composure. "We're restructuring," he added, as if that made it sound more legitimate. "We need someone with a more aggressive mindset." There it was, the word that hung in the air like smoke from a trash fire. Aggressive. Translation: younger, louder, trendier. Someone who wears Allbirds and says synergy without irony. I took a slow breath and finally sat down. Not because I was tired. I wanted to see him sweat. "Tell me something, Trent," I said, locking eyes with him across that polished mahogany table I'd fought to get for our new boardroom 5 years ago. "Did you even bother looking at my numbers? Or was this all decided over cocktails at the executive retreat?" Marla's fingers paused mid-tap. Trent glanced at her, then back at me. "Rob, this isn't personal. That's the thing about these people. They always say it's not personal right after they make it as personal as it gets. I trained half the sales team, negotiated 5 multi-million-dollar contracts that kept the company afloat through 2 market crashes, and covered for Gary when his divorce had him calling in sick for 3 weeks straight. And now I was being dismissed like I'd spilled coffee on the printer. "You're free to stay on through the transition period," Marla chimed in, voice soft like she was reading a bedtime story. "But we understand if you prefer to take severance and exit immediately." I laughed. Not loud. Just enough that they knew I wasn't crushed. Not yet, anyway. "So let me get this straight," I said, adjusting my tie, which suddenly felt a little too tight. "You're firing the guy who holds the keys to most of your top accounts, hoping some fresh grad with a LinkedIn certificate in leadership is going to magically charm them all into staying?" Trent bristled. Marla looked away. I had hit the nerve. "Good. Look," he said, tone shifting into something between condescension and damage control. "We appreciate everything you've done. Truly. But this is about the future." "Yeah, their future. Without me in it." I didn't argue. I didn't rant or flip a chair or throw a stapler, even though I've seen other guys do it over a hell of a lot less. Instead, I stood up, straightened my jacket, and said, "Well, I guess I'll go pack up the future's filing cabinets." And then I walked out. No goodbye lunch. No hallway applause. Just the dull click of the conference room door swinging shut behind me. Back at my desk, I sat for a moment, staring at the photos pinned above my monitor, my wife and kids at the Grand Canyon last summer, the same trip I'd only joined for 3 days because the McCormick deal needed hand-holding. 12 years, and I had less than 2 weeks worth of unused vacation. The young bucks thought that made me a company man. In reality, it just made me a chump. I opened my inbox. 56 unread emails, 3 of them from clients I'd onboard personally, people who'd trusted me because I was honest and available and didn't pitch them buzzwords with a grin. I clicked open a message from Denise Sorrell, VP of Partnerships at Callaway Freight. She was asking about our Q2 renewal schedule. She didn't know yet that I was gone. I hit reply, then stopped. Something in my chest felt heavier than anger, heavier than defeat. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, electric. I didn't hit send. Instead, I opened a new document, Gave it a simple title, What Comes Next? What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back like this? Be honest. Have you ever dreamed of getting revenge on a manager who tossed you aside like an outdated manual? I started typing, slow and careful, the way you disarm a trap or set one. I knew things they didn't know I remembered. I had files they forgot existed. And if they were going to treat me like I was disposable, I figured the least I could do was show them just how irreplaceable I really was. 12 years ago, I walked into that company with a beat-up laptop, a coffee thermos that leaked at the seams, and a half-decent suit I'd borrowed from my brother because my own had too much shine around the elbows. Back then, we weren't even called what we are now. We were steadfast strategic, in name only, operating out of a narrow, windowless office wedged between a payday loan shop and a tanning salon that smelled like burnt skin and coconut oil. The place had more roaches than clients, and if you ran the microwave and copier at the same time, the whole breaker flipped. We printed pitch decks at Kinko's because our office printer jammed like it had PTSD. I came in as an account coordinator, which in startup speak meant I did everything. Cold calls, spreadsheets, pitch meetings, coffee runs. I once unclogged a bathroom toilet during a client call because the landlord hadn't shown up in 2 weeks. Nobody was watching, and nobody cared, except me. I was 35, with a mortgage, 2 young kids, and a wife who was trying her damnedest to believe my career pivot from insurance to consulting was going to mean something more than ramen noodles and sleepless nights. The first year, I landed 6 new clients, 2 of which are still on the books today, or at least they were until my name got quietly erased from every relevant thread. I remember staying up until 2 in the morning learning CRM platforms we couldn't afford to train on. I remember giving presentations with $10 in my bank account and pretending like I had control of anything other than the slide clicker. And I remember the day we hit our first million in annual revenue because the founder, Nate Donnelly, bought everyone gas station beer and thanked us like we just pulled him from a burning car. Funny how fast people forget the fire you saved them from. There were good moments, I won't lie. I got promoted, not with a new title, just with more responsibility and less sleep. They called me reliable, which I eventually learned was code for we don't have to check in on him. I helped build the client services team from 2 underpaid 20-somethings to a fully operational department with protocols, pipelines, and quarterly growth charts. I trained managers who got promoted above me. I filled in when our CFO left mid-budget cycle and didn't return. I coached a guy through a panic attack minutes before a client presentation, and then covered for him so no one would find out. I showed up when people were quitting. I showed up when their marriages fell apart. I showed up when the company needed a body, a voice, a number in a chair, and never once asked what I'd get in return. It's funny what people remember and what they don't. They remembered my strong close rate when they needed investor slides. They remembered my quiet demeanor when they wanted someone to absorb a screaming client's anger without making a scene. But when Trent Whitaker rolled in with his Harvard diction and his Spotify playlists called Crush the Day, he looked right past me like I was the maintenance guy who forgot to take the trash out. I missed birthdays, both mine and my son's. I once signed a deal over the phone from a hospital parking lot while my daughter got her tonsils removed because Gary couldn't take the call and it needed to get done today. My wife cried that night. I told her it was worth it. I actually believed that. I believed loyalty mattered, that being dependable in a storm meant something to the people steering the boat. I didn't realize they were only keeping me around until they could afford to buy a shinier anchor. About 5 years in, when things started to stabilize, I asked for a promotion, not even for the title bump, just for the raise that came with it. I was told there wasn't room in the budget that quarter, even though I just closed a $300,000 retainer. That same week, Gary bought a new Mercedes and told us about it over catered sushi. I should have seen it all coming. The warning signs weren't subtle. First, the pats on the back stopped. Then, my name disappeared from client decks. Then, the interns I trained started getting looped into strategy meetings I wasn't invited to. My suggestions got buried under, we'll discuss it later, and the younger hires with louder voices got nods for recycling the very ideas I'd quietly written out 3 weeks earlier. I wasn't invisible. I was being slowly erased. And yet, I stayed. Why? Because somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that quitting would mean I'd wasted everything. That all the missed holidays, the second mortgage, the gray hairs, and the anxiety attacks were worth it. That I'd get my recognition, my reward, my moment of acknowledgement. I told myself that the people at the top remembered who got them there. They didn't. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't care. The day Trent fired me, no one stood up. No one said, but wait, Rob's been here since we were printing invoices on the back of old flyers. They all just let it happen. HR packed my desk in a cardboard box that still had the Amazon label from someone's ergonomic mousepad. Nobody asked for a handover document. Nobody even asked if I had any outstanding tasks. The final humiliation came in the elevator. A kid from marketing I barely knew stepped in with me, earbuds in, and when the doors closed, he looked over and said, "Hey man, you new here?" I didn't answer. Just smiled and nodded. Because what the hell else do you say when 12 years of your life vanish like vapor? I walked to my car, sat down in the front seat, and stared at my hands for a long time. They were shaking a little. Not from rage, not yet. Just from the sudden absence of everything. The silence. The fact that I had nowhere to be. No call to make. No fire to put out. But then something settled inside me. Not peace. Not anger either. Something colder. Something quieter. They thought I'd go away quietly. They were wrong. The last few weeks before they finally cut me loose were the kind of slow burn agony that only someone who's already dead to the company can recognize. I kept coming in, kept showing up early, kept pretending like everything was still normal, while around me the walls shifted, the names on the meetings changed, and the temperature of every room dropped 10 degrees when I walked in. No one said anything out loud, they never do. But it was in the details, the little tells, the kind of micro behaviors that only someone like me, someone who had lived and bled in that building, would notice. The first sign came in my inbox, or more accurately, the lack of it. My usual morning deluge of emails went dry almost overnight. Clients I'd spoken to weekly for years stopped looping me in. Internal messages that should have been addressed to me were suddenly going to Kyle McGovern, the bright-eyed upstart with perfect hair and a LinkedIn bio longer than his resume. Kyle had been hired to support account operations, that was the wording they used, but within a week, he was attending client strategy meetings I wasn't even invited to. Nobody told me why, and nobody had to. I could feel it in my bones. They were transitioning my accounts behind my back, probably hoping I'd just quietly fade out of relevance without making a mess. The thing about Kyle was, he wasn't even pretending to be subtle. He'd roll into meetings late, loud, grinning like he was walking into a cocktail party instead of a conference call with a 7-figure client. He used phrases like low-hanging fruit and pivot to engagement, like he thought they meant something. I sat in on one of his pitches once, one he gave to a client I'd brought in and nurtured through 2 acquisitions, and I watched as he stumbled through half-baked strategies I'd written and filed 2 years ago, now twisted into buzzword soup with his name slapped on them. The client nodded politely, but I saw the look in their eyes. Doubt. Discomfort. Confusion. It was like watching a magician botch a trick with your watch in his hands. And Trent, our fresh-faced COO, was always just nearby enough to be seen, but never close enough to answer for anything. He loved talking about culture. Culture this, culture that. We're building a culture of innovation, he said one morning in an all-hands meeting, just after announcing that half the operations team was being repurposed for agility. I knew what that meant. Everyone did. It meant cuts, demotions, layoffs disguised as promotions, and the death of institutional memory, all wrapped in the language of progress. But what bothered me most wasn't the politics. I'd survived enough regime changes to know that was inevitable. What got under my skin was the rewriting of the narrative. I started to hear things, casual comments from younger staff, suggesting that Kyle was revamping the client model, or that Trent had reorganized the account pipeline to streamline growth. As if none of us had ever done a damn thing before they walked in. As if the past decade had been some foggy prelude to the real show, which conveniently started the day they got their keycards. So I started collecting. Not out of pettiness, at least not at first, but out of necessity. I dug through my folders, scoured old hard drives, pulled saved emails and annotated pitch decks. I archived Slack threads, contracts, meeting minutes, client satisfaction surveys, anything that proved what I had built, when I'd built it, and who had been in the room when the work was done. I wasn't stupid. I knew how stories got rewritten, and I knew that once I was gone, there would be nothing left but their version. So I built my own archive, a private vault of truth, quietly labeled and carefully stored, like I was preparing to testify at a trial no one had announced yet. I never told anyone what I was doing. I just kept nodding in meetings, smiling at Kyle like I didn't know he was practicing my signature on all the accounts I used to manage. I let Trent rattle off strategic pivots in board calls without calling him out, even when half of them were ideas I proposed years ago and been told were too risky. I stopped trying to correct anyone. It was like watching someone rearrange your furniture while you were still living in the house. I figured, fine, let them move the couch. Just don't act surprised when you find out the floorboards are rotten. There was one moment that stuck with me, a conversation I overheard by accident in the break room. Kyle and another junior associate, Sam, were talking about a big West Coast client I'd landed in 2019. Kyle was laughing, saying something about how easy it had been to flip the old guy's account structure and how Rob never knew how to scale. Sam didn't respond, he just nodded awkwardly. But that was the moment I knew for sure. It wasn't that they wanted me out. It was that they wanted to erase me completely. And that's the part they never quite understand. Guys like Trent and Kyle, the ones who see experience as a liability instead of an asset. They think loyalty is a weakness. They think quiet means unaware. They think if you're not raising your voice, you're not paying attention. But I was. Every second. And I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to threaten. I wasn't going to make a scene. I was just going to wait. And when the time was right, I'd show them exactly how loud silence can be. It started like most things do in corporate life, with a spreadsheet and a hunch that nobody upstairs really knew what was happening below the glass walls of the executive floor. I didn't set out looking for dirt, not at first anyway. I just wanted to cover my ass, to make sure that if anyone tried pinning anything on me after the fact, I'd have the receipts, real ones. I knew how the story would be told once I was out of the building. They'd say the accounts had been messy, that performance had been slipping, that Trent and Kyle had stepped in just in time to steady the ship. It wouldn't matter that the ship was already pointed straight and sailing fine. They just needed a reason, any reason, to call the old captain obsolete. So I started compiling, methodically and quietly, like a man organizing his affairs before a long trip he didn't choose to take. The first document I saved was an old audit file from 3 years ago, one I'd flagged at the time because it showed a massive discrepancy between projected revenue and actual client retention. A nearly $200,000 gap that was papered over with contract realignment fees that didn't actually exist. Back then, I'd asked Gary about it and got a wave of the hand and a tired, "Rob, not your department." But now it was my department, at least in the court of accountability they were going to hold after I was gone. That file became the cornerstone of something bigger, a new folder I named Strategy Notes, innocuous enough that no one would bother to open it unless they were looking closely. By the end of the second week, that folder had grown into something else entirely, an unspoken indictment of everything wrong with the company I had once believed in. It wasn't just the cooked numbers or the shady client upsells. It was the HR cover-ups, the NDA-bound settlements, the incident with the Chicago office that quietly disappeared from all internal communication. It was the dozen or so emails from top clients expressing dissatisfaction, emails I'd forwarded to management that had never been responded to, now carefully labeled and backed up to a separate drive. I kept everything clean, clinical, no opinions or snarky commentary. Just the truth, cold and factual, with timestamps and context. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. They weren't just pushing me out to make room for new blood. They were burying the past because it was inconvenient. My past. My work. My long hours and missed holidays and decades of quiet, competent loyalty. And they were doing it while trying to sell the company's story to the market as a modern tech-forward juggernaut, helmed by a visionary leadership team that had revitalized the brand. That was the language in the IPO prep deck I found sitting open on the shared drive one Friday evening. A deck that, ironically, contained numbers I knew were inflated by at least 15%, using projections from clients we were already losing. At first, I wasn't sure what I was building. A manifesto? A landmine? Maybe just a monument to what I'd survived. But somewhere around the fifth night of staying up late in my home office, combing through archived Teams messages and PDF contracts from fiscal years gone by, I realized it was something simpler than all that. It was just the truth. Not polished, not presented, just laid bare for anyone who cared enough to look. The final file wasn't flashy. No dramatic fonts, no red-highlighted scandalous quotes, no vengeance-tinged commentary. Just folders within folders, categorized by department, date, and client. A neat timeline of decisions and consequences, of people who knew better and acted otherwise, of leadership failures dressed in buzzwords. At the top, I added one final document, a single-page summary, bullet-pointed, unemotional, stating clearly which issues could lead to legal exposure, regulatory flags, or reputational damage if disclosed. Not because I wanted to scare them, just because it was true. I renamed the main folder What Comes Next. No password. No author name. No attribution. Just a plain text file sitting in the shared drive under the folder structure where Kyle would soon go looking for client onboarding documents. I knew someone would open it. Maybe not right away. Maybe not until something went sideways, a deal fell through, a client raised hell, a regulator came knocking. But eventually, they'd find it. And when they did, it would speak for itself. On my last day, I didn't say goodbye. No one had organized a send-off, and I didn't expect one. I grabbed my jacket, cleaned out the 2 drawers I still used. The rest had already been picked over by someone from facilities, no doubt assuming I just ghosted. I left my keycard on the edge of Trent's assistant's desk with a little post-it that just said, "Done." I didn't want to make a speech. I didn't want to send some heartfelt goodbye email that would get ignored or laughed at by Kyle's crew. I just wanted to walk out with my head up, like a man who knows the storm hasn't passed, it just hasn't started yet. As I stepped out of the building for the last time, the sky was that dull kind of gray that makes everything look like it's been put on mute. I didn't feel angry, not really. I felt finished, like I'd closed a chapter someone else tried to rip out of the book entirely. I walked to my car, turned the key, and sat there for a minute, staring at the company logo on my old ID badge before I dropped it into the glove box without ceremony. It wasn't revenge. Not exactly. It wasn't sabotage either, not by the definition they'd used when the investigation started. I hadn't lied, hacked, threatened, or altered a thing. All I'd done was give them a mirror, clean, polished, and impossible to ignore. The bullet wasn't in the chamber anymore. I'd already pulled the trigger. Now all that was left was what comes next. The morning after I walked out of that glass fortress for the last time, I woke up before dawn like I always had, muscle memory still wrapped around a routine I no longer needed. But this time, there was no alarm clock blaring in the dark, no email pings from panicked colleagues, no last-minute meeting invites that could have been Slack messages. Just the low, steady hum of silence, the kind that takes getting used to after over a decade of constant pressure. I got up, made coffee in a mug my daughter painted back in 2nd grade, and sat out on the porch as the sky shifted from charcoal to blue. Golf was on the TV inside, muted. Not because I cared about the game. I just liked the background motion, the quiet civility of it all. At first, I didn't think anything would come of it, at least not right away. I figured what comes next might sit in the shared drive like a forgotten memo, just another folder buried beneath 1,000 digital priorities. Maybe someone would find it one day by accident. Maybe no one ever would. I didn't need it to be loud. I just needed it to exist. Like a warning sign you ignore until the bridge collapses. Around 10:30 that morning, my phone buzzed. Once, then again, until the screen lit up with a stack of missed calls and texts that painted a story even before I read a single word. The first was from Martin in sales. "Hey, man, you seeing this?" Then came Janet. "Rob, do you know anything about this client drop?" Then, finally, Trent himself, one short, clipped voicemail, his voice tighter than I'd ever heard it, trying too hard not to sound panicked. "Rob, if you could give me a call when you have a moment, I'd appreciate it." I didn't call back. I just kept sipping my coffee. By noon, the email started. Not from company addresses, from personal accounts. People I hadn't spoken to in months. People I never expected to hear from again. They were all saying some version of the same thing. Something leaked. Something big. Nobody knows where it came from. Apparently, someone had opened the wrong folder while prepping for a quarterly review and stumbled onto what comes next. From there, it had spread faster than a stomach bug in a kindergarten classroom. Internal investigations kicked off. HR panicked. Legal got looped in. One junior associate allegedly cried in the hallway when they realized the IPO numbers were off by more than 20%. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was exposure. There were names, dates, attachments, forwarded client complaints that had been accidentally archived, and risk reports that never made it to the board. And yet, not a single file pointed to me. Not a single word connected my name to the document. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't emailed it. I hadn't altered a damn thing. I just organized the truth, like a janitor sweeping up broken glass and leaving it in a pile for someone else to step in. I heard from Gary later that week. He called twice, never left a message. I imagined him pacing around his office, trying to piece together how the guy he dismissed as too passive, too quiet, too set in his ways, had somehow turned the whole structure upside down without ever raising his voice. I wondered if he thought I'd planned it as revenge. That would have been easier to stomach than the truth, that I didn't do it to hurt anyone. I did it because I refused to be erased. It's strange, feeling freedom for the first time in years and realizing it doesn't come with a parade or a prize or even a round of applause. It comes with silence. Long, unbroken stretches of time where no one needs anything from you. Where your value isn't tied to how fast you respond or how willing you are to sacrifice. My wife noticed it before I did. She came out to the porch one afternoon, sat beside me, and said, "You look like yourself again." I didn't even know I'd lost that guy until she pointed him out. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. Not for what I'd done, but for the fallout it caused. I heard a few decent folks got dragged into meetings they didn't deserve to be in. A couple of them might lose their jobs. Kyle was apparently on leave while the company sorted through reporting inconsistencies. Trent had stopped posting inspirational garbage on LinkedIn. Last I checked, the IPO had been quietly delayed for realignment. In corporate terms, that means buried 6 feet deep under buzzwords and shame. Did I go too far? Maybe. But I also think about the nights I stayed up writing proposals that got credited to someone else. I think about the birthdays I missed, the time my kid hit his first home run and I was stuck in a hotel room rewriting a client pitch because the junior team screwed it up. I think about the look on Trent's face when he told me I wasn't aggressive enough, like I was some relic from a time before people measured success in hashtags and self-congratulating you blasts. And I think about how, in the end, all I did was tell the truth. It wasn't my fault they didn't want to hear it. Now, I wake up when I want. I take long walks. I send job referrals to people who deserve better. I keep a journal, not because I plan to publish anything, but because it helps to remember things in my own words, not the way someone else would revise them. And every once in a while, when the mood is just right, I scroll through the news and look for any tiny ripple from that one quiet storm I left behind. Not to celebrate, not even to smirk. Just to remind myself that for once in my life, I didn't let them write the ending for me. I wrote it myself. And maybe, just maybe, I gave them exactly what they deserved.